A nitrogen death. The killer executed while proclaiming innocence over a $200 debt. Welcome back to the Justice and Injustice channel, where we uncover the most disturbing secrets of true crime cases. Now we're going to introduce you. The Anthony Todd Boyd case. Justice served or a new form of torture? Alabama just executed its 7th inmate using the controversial nitrogen gas method, and the details are haunting. Anthony Todd Boyd, convicted in the gruesome 1993 murder of Gregory Huguley, who was taped up and burned alive over a mere $200 cocaine debt, maintained his innocence right up until his last breath. We explore the horrific crime committed in that Anniston baseball field, the testimonies of the other men involved, and Boyd's tearful conviction. But more importantly, we confront the unsettling final chapter, the execution itself. We break down the Supreme Court dissent from 3 liberal justices who condemned the process as intense psychological torment. Witnesses, including Boyd's spiritual advisor, described 14 minutes of deep, shuddering breaths, choking, and a struggle for life as the nitrogen gas flowed. Was this a just ending for a brutal crime? Or as one judge put it, was it gratuitous suffering? Please like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. The crime. We're talking about a man who took his last breath while claiming his innocence, executed by a method the U.S. Supreme Court itself called a form of intense psychological torment. This is the case of Anthony Todd Boyd, the 7th inmate in Alabama to face the state's most controversial tool of death, nitrogen gas. But before we get to the chilling final minutes in the death chamber, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to a debt, a baseball field, and an act of violence so monstrous, it's hard to wrap your mind around. The year was 1993. The place, Anniston, Alabama. This entire, terrible saga started with just $200, a cocaine debt owed by a man named Gregory Huguley. On July 31st, prosecutors say Anthony Todd Boyd and 3 other men tracked Gregory down. $200. That was the price on his head. They didn't just hurt him. They didn't just threaten him. Court documents describe a level of premeditated, gratuitous horror that is almost medieval. They kidnapped Huguley at gunpoint. They stopped to buy gasoline. Then they drove to a nearby baseball field. The murder. At that baseball field, the attackers made Gregory Huguley lie down on a bench. They bound him, hands, feet, mouth taped up. They taped him to the bench. Then they doused his entire body in the gasoline they had just purchased. And they set him on fire. The men stood there, watching. Court records state they watched Huguley burn for 10 to 15 minutes until the flames finally went out. The next morning, a softball team found what remained of Gregory Huguley. The other 3 men involved would eventually testify against Boyd. One, Quinte Cox, took a plea deal for a lighter sentence. Another, Sean Ingram, the man prosecutors say actually poured the gas and lit the match, is also sitting on death row. The conviction. Anthony Todd Boyd was convicted of capital murder in 1995. But here is the unsettling truth that casts the longest shadow over this case. Prosecutors acknowledge that Boyd was not the one who set the fatal fire. Yet he was deemed an active and full participant. When the jury delivered their verdict, Boyd was in tears. He had a slew of family and friends testify for him. They described him as a good man, a good father, a role model who helped kids with their homework and coached youth basketball. And when he spoke to the news media after the verdict, his words would become a final, haunting refrain decades later. He said, and I quote, "I'll maintain my innocence until the day I die." But in October of this year, the day of his death finally arrived. And the method chosen by the state of Alabama? It ignited a fierce, final, terrifying legal battle over what the state is allowed to do to a human being, even a convicted killer, in the name of justice. It was a battle Boyd lost. The legal battle and the method. For months leading up to his execution, Boyd's attorneys had been fighting. Not just the sentence, but the method of the sentence: nitrogen gas hypoxia. The argument was simple, but chilling. In a federal court lawsuit, Boyd's legal team argued that the administration of pure nitrogen gas would cause the prisoner to experience the extreme pain and terror of suffocation while still conscious. They called it gratuitous suffering. They begged the state to use a different method. Lethal injection is complicated by drug shortages and botched executions. But Boyd's lawyers asked for something else, something faster: a firing squad. Why would a man convict of such a terrible crime ask to face a firing squad? Because he wanted to die in seconds, rather than by what his lawyers called a torturous suffocation lasting up to 4 minutes. The ruling: a federal judge rejected those arguments. Chief U.S. District Judge Emily Marks, while admitting that a person consciously deprived of oxygen experiences discomfort, panic, and emotional distress, ultimately ruled that the Eighth Amendment does not guarantee Boyd a painless death. It only guarantees a death free of needless suffering. But the argument didn't end there. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The highest court in the land had the chance to grant Boyd a stay, to block the execution, or at least force the state to use another method. They refused. The majority allowed the execution to proceed. But 3 of the court's liberal judges, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, Justice Elena Kagan, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, spoke out in a powerful, scathing dissent that has echoed across the entire country. Justice Sotomayor wrote, "Boyd asks for the barest form of mercy. The Constitution would grant him that grace. My colleagues do not." She didn't stop there. She asked the public to imagine what it would be like. Imagine convulsing, gasping for air, while nitrogen gas is being pumped through a face mask. Your body's instinctual urge to breathe kicks in, but your mind understands that breathing only results in death. She argued this psychological torment, this deliberate suffocation, violates the Constitution's ban against cruel and unusual punishment. This isn't just an abstract legal debate. This is the argument that a man, condemned for a crime of unimaginable brutality, should not have to face a final punishment that is itself an act of torture. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall, however, has stood by the method. He's previously defended nitrogen gas as constitutional and effective. For the state, this is simply upholding the law and delivering justice. But the objections are mounting. Other witnesses to previous nitrogen executions had described the inmates' final moments in grim detail: conscious terror for several minutes, writhing under their restraints, vigorous convulsing and shaking, heaving, spitting, and a conscious struggling for life. One Ohio official, Lou Tobin, director of the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association, told lawmakers considering the method, "The Constitution doesn't guarantee a pain-free death, but whatever they experience as part of an execution pales in comparison to the pain and suffering that they've inflicted on their victims. It's a chilling calculus of pain." And in the final hours, Anthony Todd Boyd had one last desperate plea. The final hours and last words. In the days leading up to his scheduled execution, Boyd recorded a message. It was a plea not to the courts, but to the most powerful person in the state, Republican Alabama Governor Kay Ivey. He said he needed to prove his innocence. He pleaded with her to come sit down and talk to me before this execution is carried out. Before an innocent man is executed, he challenged her. Do the right thing and stop this execution. Governor's office refused to meet with him. They said they personally review each execution, and that a one-on-one meeting hours before the scheduled death was especially unworkable. They reiterated the court's finding. Boyd was an active and full participant in a horrific murder. At 6:33 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, October 23rd, the execution was set to conclude. But just before the executioner started the flow of gas, Boyd was given his final moment to speak. His final words were a direct challenge to the state and a final profession of innocence. He said, "I just want to say again, I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody. I just want everyone to know there is no justice in this state." Then the mask was secured. The chamber doors were sealed, and the nitrogen began to flow. Transition. What happened next is the core of the controversy. It is what separates the legal argument from the terrifying reality. It is the reason 3 Supreme Court justices spoke out. It is the final, disturbing account of the nitrogen death. The witness accounts. Multiple media witnesses and Boyd's spiritual advisor, the Reverend Jeff Hood, were in the chamber. They had a clear, unblinking view of what happened from the moment the gas began flowing at 5:57 p.m. CT. The first thing they reported? Boyd's legs immediately raised several inches off the gurney. For the next 14 minutes, Boyd took deep, shuddering breaths. His brother, who was also a witness, reportedly said, "It's like he's gasping for air." Think about the time frame. 14 minutes. That's enough time to listen to 3 or 4 songs. That's enough time to walk half a mile. That's how long witnesses say Anthony Todd Boyd was consciously fighting for air. Around 6:15 p.m., 18 minutes after the gas began, Boyd's breathing became shallow. He began taking choking breaths. He appeared to jolt his head slightly, and then it lolled back and then side to side. His last breaths came around 6:17 p.m., but his spiritual advisor, the Rev Hood, had a different timeline and an even more unsettling observation. By Hood's watch, Boyd appeared to be conscious and actively fighting for his life for at least 19 minutes. And Hood reported something else. He believed Boyd's mask was not sealed properly. If true, that would have allowed more oxygen in, prolonging the horrifying suffocation process, making the death far slower and more agonizing than even the controversial protocol called for. After the execution, Rev Hood was distraught. He told reporters, "It's torture. We shouldn't do this to anybody. We are better than this. We are better than suffocating people to death." The Alabama Attorney General's office did not immediately respond to questions about the mask seal or the exact time the execution took. They simply issued a statement saying that Gregory Huguley's family had finally received justice. But as the controversy swirls, the questions remain, hanging heavy in the air like the nitrogen itself. Was this justice? Or was this a deliberate, prolonged act of suffering, disguised as a constitutional execution? Is the state willing to risk conscious terror and gratuitous suffering simply to bypass the challenges of lethal injection? And if Anthony Todd Boyd was fighting for air for nearly 20 minutes, if the mask was leaking, then what does that say about the entire method and the state's ability to administer death without being cruel and unusual? Retrospective and the unsettling questions. The execution of Anthony Todd Boyd is a tragic knot of ethical, legal, and human darkness. On one side, you have the memory of Gregory Huguley taped, doused, and burned alive over a drug debt. A truly heinous, terrifying crime that screams for accountability. On the other, you have a man who, until the very end, swore he was innocent of the fatal act, yet was convicted and sentenced to death. A man who, in his last moments, experienced a method of execution that critics, including Supreme Court justices, say is indistinguishable from torture. Even if you believe in the death penalty, the question remains, does the punishment need to mirror the cruelty of the crime? Does the search for justice require a state-sanctioned suffocation? The argument that the Constitution doesn't guarantee a painless death is technically correct. But the difference between a quick, relatively clean death and one involving minutes of conscious struggling for life, of choking, of panic, is the very line the Eighth Amendment was created to protect. Boyd's death is not an isolated incident. The debate over nitrogen gas has been ongoing. The state of Alabama and others considering the method are moving forward despite the mounting evidence of distress and suffering reported by witnesses. They are trading one flawed method, lethal injection, for another that appears to be equally, if not more, unsettling and brutal. The problem isn't just the gas. It's the protocol, the mask, the time it takes, and the agonizing psychological terror of knowing you are suffocating, unable to stop it. And then there's the haunting finality of Boyd's plea. Even if he was fully involved in the horrific kidnapping, even if he deserved the most severe penalty, what if his assertion that he didn't participate in the actual burning was true? He went to his death maintaining that his was a case of no justice. Whether you see Anthony Todd Boyd as a monstrous killer finally facing justice, or a flawed man who was executed after a terrifying ordeal, this case is a stark warning. It's a terrifying glimpse into a justice system that is willing to experiment with new methods of execution, even when the evidence points to a process that is anything but humane. Because the justice for Gregory Huguley and the closure for his family is supposed to be the end of the story. But for the state of Alabama, the execution of Anthony Todd Boyd is just the beginning of a terrifying new chapter. Call to action and closing thoughts. The story of Anthony Todd Boyd forces us all to look into the darkness and ask what price we are truly willing to pay for justice. Is it justice if the punishment itself is considered torture? Is it closure if the execution method creates a new victim in the eyes of the law?